Hello and welcome to Psychological Insights. Guilt. It's a small little word, but it packs a lot of punch. Is it good to be guilty? Is it bad to be guilty? How do you develop guilt? Or should you develop guilt? Should you raise your children to be guilty or not to be guilty? And what's the difference between guilt and remorse? Today we'll be speaking to Dr. Robert Hamm. He's a psychologist in West Hartford Center. I'm Pat Kazakoff. You're watching Psychological Insights. Stay with me. Guilt. That's such an interesting topic, Dr. Hamm. Why did you choose guilt? And especially now we're in the holiday season. There's a lot of festivizing going on. Why guilt?
Well, yeah, I did think that perhaps it is pertinent to the season, our sense of belonging and obligations to other people. But honestly, this is a topic that I have been thinking about for some time. And I'm thinking this would be a good start to write a series on the human emotions. No particular reason why we're starting with guilt. It's a universal emotion, as all emotions are, pretty much.
So what about, so how does one, there are people who are not guilty, are there not? They don't feel guilt.
Yes, I mean, we all know about the sociopath or the
Well, that's the extreme example. But what about a person who's not a sociopath? He's not killing anybody. He's not doing anything like that. But he doesn't feel a high degree of guilt. How does that happen?
Well, it's a very simple question that requires a very complicated answer. I think that guilt is, as I said, it's a human emotion. So it's normal and it's necessary in order for our society to function.
So everybody should have guilt? Is that good?
Yes, it is.
It's
an essential emotion. It's part of being a social creature. It has to do with our sense of obligation and responsibility to other people in our community.
So you're telling me that people who don't have a strong sense of obligation to other people don't have a strong sense of guilt.
That's right. I think that guilt is the internalization of this obligation that we have, that is the price that we pay for being social creatures. Yes.
And so how does this develop? Does it develop when you're young, or do you get it when you're older? Is it a higher level function? How do you get to have what I'm hearing you say is the appropriate amount of guilt to function well in society?
You know, no one knows for sure. We can go back to the founders of modern psychology, and the first person we think of is Freud, of course. So Freud wrote about guilt, and he believed that it's something that develops through we know about the Oedipus complex, that children have fantasies, according to Freud, this is speculation of course, of having feelings towards their parents that has to do with incest and patricide. When they begin to develop a sense of these longings, they have to manage this. And the Oedipus complex, it has to do with how one negotiates those feelings. And successfully negotiated, one identifies with one's same-sex parent and relinquishes one's desires and develops a sense of socialization, internalization of identity and with that, a sense of morality and obligation to others.
So this is Freud's theory, but has that been debunked? I mean, it's a little bit difficult to hear about the, patricide and incest and Oedipus complex. It's a little bit hard to buy that. So, and you mentioned at the beginning, you said that it's a theory, but now is that theory debunked now? Are there new theories that have taken over from that?
Well, I think that it's something that develops with our growing awareness that we are a part of our society, a part of our families, a part of our communities. There are different theorists who have offered explanations, but it mainly has to do with our ability to identify with other people. So this was Freud's explanation about how we develop a sense of guilt is through identification. Identification with who? With our same-sex parent. But yes, it is speculation. Has it been debunked? Well, Freud has been, I think, debunked in many instances for various reasons. But nonetheless, I think his ideas do carry a germ of truth to them, and they've stimulated a lot of thought. Now, one of his followers, Melanie Klein, came up with a different.
Right, completely different.
So
love-hate.
So she believed that guilt is something that we're sort of born with, in a sense, that we have this sense of relatedness, that it comes with our just being relationship-oriented creatures. So we are sort of made that way.
So would you say, if we take this a little bit further, it's all about ideation. Even though Freud and Melanie Klein had different theories, their theories were both based on ideation, that you have to identify with something. You have to identify. So if you don't identify, let's say you're a young man or a young woman, and you do not identify with your parent of the same sex, would you say that that person becomes more guilt-ridden? Is that generalizing that?
If you don't identify with
If you don't identify, you have a father and you don't identify with him, would that make you, would that somehow do something to the guilt? Would that somehow not develop normally?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, frankly. Freud's idea is that through identification we develop a sense of guilt, that we become aware of our feelings of aggression, and we navigate that. If we can do it successfully, we identify, and then through identification, we develop feelings for others. We have a sense of our awareness of our responsibility to other people. That's called internalization. So guilt is an internalization of a necessary element that in order to live with other people, our obligations to others. So guilt evolves normally. Kohlberg and Piaget's stages of moral development offers these kinds of speculative ideas about how emotions such as guilt evolve. So it starts with a sense of our being belonging and being related to others, but our motivations are not based on an internalization so much of our relationships with others, but rather the consequences of our actions. So that our motivations to do well or to please others has more to do with a fear of punishment and a desire for reward. And then later, as children get a little older, they understand rules, concepts, and so it evolves in that direction. But eventually, ideally, the sense of guilt is something that becomes internalized, where we must feel a sense of empathy, where we can be able to project ourselves into another person and understand how that they feel something, and that our behaviors have an impact on how they feel, and an understanding about the reasons why they feel what they do. That's internalization. Guilt is an internalization of our sense of obligations towards others. It's something that evolves gradually through psychological development. Normally, we all develop that sense, but not everybody does.
Mm-hmm. And so what would be the circumstances that would have a person not develop that sense of guilt?
Well, I think obviously if a child is not raised in an environment where expectations are made of them, which bring to them this sense of responsibility or accountability for their actions, they're not going to ever have the opportunity, will they, to understand that what they do has an impact on others, nor will they feel any sense or need to have to develop. They'll be so self-centered, so egocentric, that because they won't have the opportunity, there aren't those kinds of contingencies or consequences on their actions.
So you're in private practice in West Hartford
Mm-hmm.
Center.
Right.
When someone comes to see you, can you see that lack of emotion in them? Is there something that you can, like, just look at them and say, this person is egocentric, this person is narcissistic, they don't have a strong sense of guilt, and they were brought up in a way? Can you see it on some level?
That's a very good question. Can I see it? No.
You can't see it.
No, it's not something that shows itself readily, ordinarily. These things are evidence themselves in my private practice or in interpersonal relationships based on a person's history.
So once you do an intake and once you talk to them, it becomes clear.
So if a person has a criminal record, or if they are seeing me because of some kind of behavior where they have harmed others, then that's evidence often that there's some kind of something that's lacking in their sense of responsibility or empathy for their actions.
So how do you develop? You're meeting people as adults. How does that person develop that empathy that's necessary in order to feel guilt or remorse or something?
Mm-hmm. Well, we talk about what the consequences of those actions are, and help them to understand by discussing what the consequences are, how develop an awareness of how another person feels, and that takes a certain degree of mindfulness on their parts and a discussion about anticipating.
Are there any other ways to develop this kind of, because basically it's a consciousness.
Mm-hmm, that's right.
You have to be conscious of what you're doing or not doing.
Mm-hmm.
And then from that consciousness, then you develop the guilt.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to have the consciousness. So is there another way of developing consciousness?
Not that I know of. I mean, I think that often people who, someone who has an antisocial personality or a narcissistic, these are what we call cluster B personality disorders. They develop defenses that justify or that reinforce their behaviors where they do harm to others or they lack empathy. So one of the common defenses that someone with this kind of disorder will use is rationalization. And in other words, they will justify to themselves why they can do this.
Because it's fine.
That somehow that other people owe them something, or it's it's some kind of vindication that can be used as a justification, or it doesn't really, it doesn't bother them. It's okay. It's not really that harmful.
They don't know about it.
Well,
Well, that's the rationalization.
They rationalize. These ego defenses are used by people who do harm to others, who don't have a sufficient sense of empathy and therefore guilt. They use these rationalizations or defenses to justify their behaviors. So when you're working with a patient like that, you have to help them to understand how they are able to sort of talk their way through these situations so that they are able to justify actions that are harmful or lack sufficient empathy for the consequences of their actions on others, and help them to understand that ultimately it affects them. And that's why they're seeing me. Often they've gotten into trouble of one sort or another. A person who lacks empathy ordinarily doesn't come in to see a psychologist.
Right. I can imagine someone coming in and saying, "Hi, I lack empathy. It's not doing well for me." I mean, it doesn't make sense. There has to have been some sort of consequence.
That's right. There's often that there has been, either they've been ordered by the court or they've gotten into trouble in their marriage. And a person who has a lack of empathy externalizes their explanations for problems. In other words, they blame others. So it's hard for them to see how their actions originate from their own difficulties in understanding how they lack sufficient empathy towards others.
And how long does, I mean, and I'm listening to you, it seems like this is like a long process, but like for a person to feel empathy, it took a whole life not to feel empathy. How long is the process to develop that way? Like how long do you have to work with them? Is there like a certain period of time that you work with them where you can see progress?
It takes a long time.
What's long?
Years and years.
Years
working
and years.
with a personality disorder, if we're talking about personality disorders, which I think we are generally speaking, because personality is so deeply embedded, in our sense of self, and we are blind to understanding our defenses, other people, or the consequences of our actions are the only way that we can get feedback about who we are. So most of these problems of people with personality, they're subconscious. They don't understand it, and it's just woven into their personality. So in order to deal with those things and help a person to understand it and change, takes years and years of efforts. Yep, in therapy. Yep.
I'm getting tired listening to you. Yeah. What about remorse? How is remorse different than guilt?
Well, actually, it's not different. Remorse is different than regret. That's the distinction. We might say that guilt or a sense of obligations towards others, as I was saying, guilt is an internalization of our obligations to others. A regret is an emotion that ordinarily it's something that we feel when we wish that we didn't do something, and it's not the same as guilt in that guilt has to do with empathy.
And what does remorse have to do with?
Well, I mean, remorse is another kind of guilt. It's a deeper, more mature, I would say, sense of guilt where we're motivated to do well to others because we understand, we care about others deeply, and the impact on what we do. We feel the impact of what we do on others because we're able to identify, we're able to empathize. That's remorse. It has to do with a deeper sense of empathy, an internal understanding of what others feel, and that includes the consequences of our actions on others. Regret comes from our awareness of our consequences of our actions, but doesn't require empathy towards others. So
there's a distinction. There's a distinction between the regret and the remorse. And what about the distinction between guilt and remorse? What's the difference there?
Well, I think that guilt is...
Because you mentioned that remorse was a more mature kind of emotion.
Yes, a more mature
deeper
form of guilt, if you will. Guilt, remorse and guilt are the same thing, basically, that in order to feel a sense of guilt towards others in a truly evolved and mature way, we must empathize with others. And remorse, to me, is a feeling that comes from our ability to identify. And that requires a certain degree of maturity, it doesn't, emotionally, where we're able to understand how others feel and care about how others feel.
So let me ask you now, you're in practice for many, many years. Is there a bigger degree of guilt and remorse now in society than there was? Does that have any basis? Are you dealing more with this problem now than you were, let's say, 10, 20 years ago?
I think it's a very good question. I'm concerned, I don't know if I see it more in my practice, but I'm concerned about where we are heading in civilization. We live in these times, I don't want to get too political here, but things are more divisive, and we seem to be moving more and more to the right throughout the world right now. And that movement, and I think our changes in society that is in cyberspace, it creates a greater degree of alienation that people feel towards one another, a less of a sense of belonging, less of a sense of obligation. So the more that we found our relationships with one another on the internet, for example, it's like driving in an automobile in road rage. I think people feel that there's a sense of license because of that anonymity, less of a sense of identity with others, and more of a sense of entitlement, and I think the same with the internet.
So that speaks exactly, that works towards developing the lack of empathy.
Yes.
Everything is working so that people aren't empathetic. There's a lot of pressures not to be empathetic.
I am concerned about that.
That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, our discussion is going more political now, but yeah, I mean, if you look at what's happened on television, for example, in the media, we've developed a tribalism today. People aren't really listening to one another. We're not working in a bipartisan way anymore. Now it's us against them. There's more of a tribal. So that, to me, works against a sense of empathy, works against developing a sense of responsibility and a sense of guilt, if you will, or an internalization of obligations to work together.
The other way of looking at it, if I can interject, the other way of looking at it is that the tribalism makes people feel part of something, makes you feel that you belong to something, and part of the problem with being empathetic is that you don't belong to anything. So could it be looked at like that also? Like, you're part of a tribe, and that sort of makes you feel belonging and has a responsibility. Instead of the greater world, you're part of a smaller group that you can identify with, that gives you obligations and responsibilities. Does that?
Ultimately, no, I would disagree with that. I think tribalism is based on, I'm going to just belong to those people who agree with me. So I don't have any obligation to be able to negotiate differences with others. It's us against them. I think that's a bad premise in order to develop successful relationships in general. If you're involved in a relationship You have to understand that your partner or your friends or your significant other is not the same as you, is not going to see things, and they're going to do things that annoy you or hurt you. In order to have a successful relationship, you have to be able to feel a sense of caring and empathy towards them, even if you don't always like them.
Right.
That's a more difficult thing to do, but I think that allows people a greater potential to develop successful long-term relationships.
You know, I'm listening to you, I'm getting tired just listening, because I can see what an incredible burden it must be for someone who doesn't have the empathy for people. It's just so unpleasant. It's so unpleasant not to have empathy for people. You miss out so much. There's so much you're missing in the human connection if you don't have empathy.
Well, that's a very empathic thing to say, Pat. Yes, that's very nice of you. But honestly, people who don't have that sense are not weary, are not tired by it. They're confused. They live in a world that they don't understand why it is that problems arise, and it keeps happening over again when they don't see what they're doing. They don't understand it because they don't know themselves well enough. They're not able to empathize with others. So it's more of a confused state than a sense of tiredness or weariness on their part.
Okay. Well, I'm listening. I'm learning also as I'm speaking to you.
Yeah.
Well, we've been speaking to Dr. Robert Hamm, a psychologist in West Hartford Center, and we're talking about guilt and how you develop guilt. And it seems that there's a certain amount of guilt that's good for you. It's part of empathizing with people. It's part of being with people. It's part of the responsibilities and obligations that gives life meaning. Is there anything else you want to say to me, Dr. Hamm, before we leave? It's a big topic.
I think that guilt it gets a bad rap. We ordinarily think of this as a negative emotion, but the point I want to make is that it's a necessary feeling. It's a good thing. It's what it makes society work. It's what helps relationships work. It's just when it's not sufficient, as in certain personality disorders, or too much in survivor's guilt or depression or bereavement, when it causes unnecessary suffering, that it becomes problematic.
Well, that's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing that it's a necessary part of life. It's a good part of life. Too much of it is not good. Too little of it is not good.
Right.
But if we could just get the right amount, it makes the world work better.
Okay, I'll agree with that.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Right,
Thank you, Dr. Hamm. Interesting as always.
Thank you.